Going to start with Malachi chapter 2 and verse 14 this morning. Malachi being the last book in the Old Testament, and God here through Malachi addresses a whole range of problems that have arisen amongst the Jewish people. Malachi chapter 2 and verse 14, yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your marriage companion and your wife by covenant. You'll notice there that God, through Malachi, speaks of a wife as your companion, husband's companion. Cattell's Theological Dictionary says, and I quote, the ideas of companionship of life and in law are intermingled here. And the reason that he mentions the idea of companionship in law is that the wife is also your wife by covenant, by agreement. But you've got this idea here of companionship. Webster's Third New International Dictionary gives a number of definitions of the word companion. Number one that accompanies or is in the company of another. One much in the company of another. And then 2a, a partner or associate, especially in some legal or formal relationship as a spouse or professional colleague. So a companion is one who is with another, and one who spends a lot of time with another. Cattell's dictionary, going back to that, spoke of a companionship of life. So the idea there is that a wife is with her husband going through all the experiences of life throughout life. They make that journey together side by side. In fact, here in Malachi chapter 2 and verse 14, there's a number of aspects of marriage that are mentioned. The idea of she is the wife of your youth. The idea here that she is your marriage companion. The idea that she is your wife by covenant or by agreement. And that's important because the relationship between a husband and wife, marriage, is not some casual relationship that you can simply walk away from, but rather it is a binding relationship. And another point here in Malachi chapter 2 and verse 14 is that that God is a witness here. It says, for what reason? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth. And that reminded me of a passage way back in Genesis chapter 31, beginning in verse 44, where you've got a meeting between Jacob and Laban. Jacob had been married to, or Jacob was married to the two daughters of Laban. Laban had tricked him. Jacob leaves eventually, and then Laban chases after him, and they meet. So Genesis 31 verse 44, this is Laban speaking. So now come, let's make a covenant you and I, and it shall be a witness between you and me. Then Jacob took a stone and set it up as a memorial stone. Jacob said to his relatives, gather stones. So they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. And you're aware of that. Sometimes when you go certain places, there's I wish I could think of the name, but a pile of stones that form a memorial, and that's what the two men construct here in their meeting place. Verse 47, now Laban called it Jegar Sahujitha, and because that's Laban speaking, that means the heap of witness, but this is in Aramaic. And then Jacob calls it Gilead, which again means the heap of witness, but Jacob is using the Hebrew word. Then verse 48, Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me this day." Therefore it was named Gilead and Mizpah, and Mizpah means watchtower. For he said, "May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are absent one from another. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take wives beside my daughters, though no one else is with us, see, God is witness between you and me." So the idea was Jacob was heading south, a long way south, with his wives and the family. Laban would be left well to the north. They wouldn't be, in contact with each other. But the point here is God would watch over the situation. God would know what was going on. And so both in the time of Jacob and around 1500 years later in the time of Malachi, we've got this idea that God is a witness to the marriage relationship. God sees what is going on within that relationship and how one partner treats the other. And so because of the relationship that should exist between a husband and wife, we ask the question, through domestic violence and other forms of abuse, is a wife to be changed from the husband's companion to the husband's victim? Now, last week I spoke of how God and Christ regard women. I spoke of how men in general should regard women in general. I spoke about how husbands in particular should regard their wives in particular. And today I want to go on from there and talk about early intervention, about what parents in particular can do to help their children to grow up to have a healthy attitude towards marriage and to their spouses, the ones they marry. But first of all, I want to look at a series of 5 short passages, beginning with Ezekiel chapter 20, beginning in verse 18. And these 5 passages, one after another, illustrate the negative impact that parents and the older generation can have upon children, the younger generation. Now, even though here in Ezekiel 20 we're in the time of the Babylonian captivity, God is actually speaking of events that occurred in Israel or amongst the Israelites back during the time of the wilderness wanderings. So Exodus chapter 20 verses 18 to 21, God's speaking here. "Instead, I said to their children in the wilderness, do not walk in the statutes of your fathers, or keep their ordinances, or defile yourselves with their idols. I am the Lord your God. Walk in my statutes and keep my ordinances and follow them. Sanctify my Sabbaths, and they shall be a sign between me and you, so that you may know that I am the Lord your God. But the children rebelled against me. They did not walk in my statutes." And so it goes on. God's speaking back in the time of the wilderness wandering, says, don't follow the ways of your fathers. God says that they did. So the negative influence, the negative conduct of the older generation was passed on to the younger ones. We then go back to 1 Kings 22. I am working here in chronological order, but not all the books in the Old Testament are in chronological order. 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 51 to 53. We come here to the northern kingdom of Israel after Israel as a nation split. And here we come to the time of Ahaziah, king of Israel. And also mentioned in this reading is Jeroboam. Jeroboam was the one who about 80 years earlier had been the first king of the divided kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, and he was the one that made idolatry the state religion. So picking it up from 1 Kings 22 verse 51, Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel in Samaria in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And he reigned over Israel for 2 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in the way of his mother, and in the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who misled Israel into sin. So he served Baal, who was a false god, and worshipped him, and provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger according to all that his father had done. And you notice the words, he walked in the way of his father and in the way of his mother. They influenced him to follow evil. Then we go a bit further ahead in time to 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 1 to 4. Passage that Isaac just read for us a while ago. This is the southern kingdom of Judah. This is another Ahaziah. It's not the same one. It's another king about 10 or 11 years after the death of Ahaziah, king of Israel. And, well, let me read it first. Then the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, king in his place. For the band of men who came with the Arabs to the camp had killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor to act wickedly. So he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors after the death of his father, to his own destruction. Again, you see the corrupt influence of the older ones on the son in this case, and that includes his own mother, because his mother was the granddaughter of the evil king Omri, who had been king of Israel, and she was the daughter of the evil king Ahab, who had been king of Israel. And then she married into the line of the kings of Judah, and he was a corrupt influence on her son there. 2 more examples here. We're going to go to the minor prophets, to Amos chapter 2 and verse 4. So the minor prophets start with Hosea. We go Hosea, Joel, Amos. But I know you've got e-Bibles, and so you just press buttons. But Amos chapter 2 and verse 4. Amos was a prophet somewhere around 760 BC. This is what the Lord says: for 3 offenses of Judah and for 4 I will not revoke its punishment, because they rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his statutes. Their lies also have led them astray, those which their fathers followed. So they're following the same mistruths, falsities as their fathers had also followed. So once again, a corrupt influence. And then finally, Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 9, beginning in verse 12, going through to verse 14. Jeremiah was a prophet to Judah in the years leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. He was a prophet from about 628 to 586 BC, so over 40 years. So we read from Jeremiah 9 and verse 12, who is the wise person who may understand this? And who is he to whom the mouth of the Lord has spoken, that he may declare it? Why is the land destroyed, laid waste like the desert, so that no one passes through? The Lord said, because they have abandoned my law, which I put before them, and have not obeyed my voice, nor walked according to it, but have followed the stubbornness of their heart and the Baals, as their fathers taught them. So here you've got 5 passages over an 800-year period, all indicating a negative influence from the older generation to the younger generation, particularly from parents towards their children. And so the question arises, well, what has this got to do with domestic violence and abuse? Well, let me read to you some quotes from sources dealing with marital conflict. This first quote comes from Dr. Grant Martin in a book called Counseling for Family Violence and Abuse. Spousal abuse, and I'm using that word spouse a few times, that, refers to the relationship with husband and wife. Spousal abuse is not only a violation of a person's right to safety and security, it contaminates the lives of children who live with violence. Research shows there is a real danger that children will learn aggressive behavior patterns if exposed to them in their homes. Violent patterns of behavior are transmitted from generation to generation. Abused children often become abusive parents and spouses. And then we go to a site, an online site from SciCentral, it's called .com. The heading for this was "What Causes Domestic Violence?" And I looked at this last Monday. Domestic violence is a choice on the part of the abuser, but certain underlying factors might sometimes contribute to a person's propensity for abuse, including witnessing domestic violence as a child. And then, or quoting from the same source, research suggests much of domestic violence behavior is learned. Children who witness domestic abuse may grow up thinking physical or psychological violence are acceptable ways to solve conflict. In the same way, raising children to believe a different gender is inferior may result in exhibiting controlling behavior later in life. So if you teach your children by one means or another to believe that women are inferior, or if in the case of your daughter that men are inferior, that can lead to problem behavior later on. And then a book called Happiness is a Choice. This is by Doctors Minerth and Meyer. Approximately 85% of our adult behavior patterns are firmly entrenched by our 6th birthday. In those crucial first 6 years of life, we copied our parents' behavior patterns, especially the parent of the same sex, so boys imitating fathers, girls imitating mothers. We learn to automatically do what they did. And other sources back that up, that it's in those very early years of life that you're shaping your child for their life. Now, as one of these sources says, the online source, there is no one cause of domestic violence. And I plan to talk about that in a final lesson in the series next week. But nevertheless, parental example is a significant factor. So, one way to reduce the risk of domestic violence and abuse is shaping your children as they grow older. By you, the parent, displaying positive behavior, positive attitudes in your relationship with your spouse. Your children are already observing that. Even if they're quite young, they're already observing how you and your wife or husband relate to one another. So what's some positives that we can do? Well, let's go over to Proverbs 22 and verse 6, because there's a general statement here. We want to avoid being a negative example. We want to try to be positive in every way. Proverbs 22 and verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he grows older, he will not abandon it. Now, Proverbs by their nature are generalizations. They're a general principle. And there's an awful lot of influences which can affect children, can affect a child as they grow older. And a child may grow up to choose the wrong path despite every positive effort on the parent's part. And in fact, two negative influences that can pull children away from a positive example are, number one, personality disorders, if they go undiagnosed and not treated, and also substance abuse, drugs, and that we know is a major problem that we have to try to deal with. But as a general principle, if you train up a child in the way that he or she should go, then they will follow that path. So what we've got to try to do is minimize the negatives and emphasize the positives. How can we do that? Well, we start with teaching. We go back to Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8 for a start. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8, listen, my son, to your father's instruction and do not ignore your mother's teaching. So we've got both mum and dad here teaching children. Teaching children what? Well, teaching them on all aspects of life and conduct and so forth. Teaching them about relationships, teaching them about salvation, teaching them about the treatment of others and so forth. Parents can give their children positive teaching in regard to these things. And in connection with that, there is also the need to set a positive example. And so we don't just tell our children what to do, but we show them what to do by the way we conduct ourselves. Fathers, your conduct as a husband is teaching your son or your sons how a husband should treat his wife. And mothers, your conduct as a wife is teaching your daughter or your daughters how they should respond to their husbands. And no matter how old your children are, even if your children at the moment are quite young, you are already teaching them how to be a wife or a husband, because they are watching your conduct in the home. That is already happening right now. So teaching, setting a positive example. And if you come over to Proverbs 29 and verse 17, another factor here is correction. Turning them away from negative behavior towards positive behavior. Correct your son and he will give you comfort. He will also delight your soul. You know, a few years ago, there was a series of adverts, I think they were dealing with this subject, domestic violence. And the one I remember is of a group of people being in the backyard, a family, and a boy was acting aggressively towards his sister. And the parents are there and they see that and they say, you know, this isn't right, we have to do something. So dad has to go and talk to the boy and say, no, that's not the way that you treat females. And that has to happen at times. We know with our children, we've got to teach them that some things are wrong and we've got to show them what is right. Now, bad behaviour sometimes gets excused on the basis that, well, boys will be boys. You know, boys, they like a bit of roughhouse and so forth. So you just got to, accept it. Well, if you dismiss negative behaviour, what are you doing? You're reinforcing it. You're saying that's okay. And as I was writing this a few days ago, my thoughts went to rugby league. And the comment that I used to make was, year after year after year with rugby league, it seems that we're hardly into the season before there's newspaper headlines and court cases about footballers mistreating females and particularly mistreating their wives. Well, what do? Well, boys will be boys. I mean, after all, this is footy, mate. You can't expect them to be anything else. No, you've got to act. And so training programs were put in force to teach footballers that aggressive behaviour towards women was unacceptable. And they were taught how they should behave towards women. And I remember at the time thinking, this is pretty pathetic. You've got to teach a bunch of grown men how to treat women. But there was a problem. And obviously some of them didn't know how to conduct themselves. And so they had some courses to deal with that. Not only that, but I believe the league goes even further. And if somebody is charged with violence towards women and domestic abuse, I understand that they're stood down right away until the case is clarified. And so the league is saying, we're not going to tolerate that sort of behaviour. And so it needs to be too with our children, that as they grow up, we let them know that if they're mistreating others, particularly boys mistreating females, then parents have got to step in and say, no, that's not right. So there's correction. Then we go over into the New Testament and we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 20. And what Paul is talking about here has to do with culture and the fact that cultural attitudes vary. Now, Paul here in 1 Corinthians 9, beginning in verse 20, is talking about how he has to deal with that in regard to evangelism. Verse 20, to the Jews I became as a Jew so that I might gain Jews. To those who are under the law I became as one under the law, though not being under the law myself, so that I might gain those who are under the law. He's talking about the Old Testament law. To those who are without the law I became as one without the law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might gain those who are without the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might gain the weak. Paul adjusted culturally depending upon where he was. He didn't change the gospel, but people conduct themselves in certain ways, talk in certain ways, relate in certain ways. Paul made those adjustments, and we can probably relate to the fact that today cultural variations affect a range of relationships. That includes sometimes the way of raising children, and it includes sometimes the relationship between husbands and wives. And I had that brought out to me, it might have been a year or so ago. You know that on Thursday mornings I spend a couple of hours helping teach English to migrants at Bankstown Library. And we were talking one day, and somehow or other the subject of the home came up, and the idea of husbands helping their wives around the house, and particularly in the kitchen. And a group of the women there, all from the same culture, burst out laughing. And one of them said, our husbands would never dream of helping in the house or in the kitchen. It's just not part of our culture. Well, I can understand that. I even read something by an American, a preacher, some years ago, where he said, well, he'd help his wife in the kitchen, providing his children weren't there to see it. And I thought, well, that's a strange problem. But these cultural variations can apply in more serious areas as well, in regard to for instance, what husbands expect of their wives' attitude towards their husbands, what husbands expect or how husbands treat their wives. This has cultural factors. Now, something we need to understand here is that God's word overrules culture. If God's word teaches one thing and culture practices something else, then culture needs to change. We can't just say, well, in my culture, this is the way or that is the way. If God's saying something different, we say, okay, Lord, I need to change my ways. I've spoken to school teachers, both here in the school. I've had a long relationship with this school, but elsewhere, where both the men and the women talk about how dealing with boys, particularly from certain cultures, there comes a stage in their development where the teachers have to handle a difficult time of adjustment, where these boys, by their culture, begin to assert their masculinity and especially begin to challenge female teachers. And so school teachers have learned to deal with that aspect and to say, well, in Australia, things are done a bit differently. And indeed, even Australian culture, you know, in the past, Aussie blokes used to talk about Sheilas. There was a certain ochre view of women by men. If you don't understand the word ochre, ask Warren. Similarly, the surfy culture. There's a movie and a book about surfy culture back, I think, in the 60s, maybe the 70s, where the Aussie male surfer was the dominant and the surfy girls were there as followers to do the will of these bronzed Aussie males. Well, again, some things have to adjust, and so parents need to help their children to adjust to God's culture. It may not, you know, many of us here, including me, are immigrants. We've come from other backgrounds, and maybe we've been aware of some adjustments that we need to make and that we need to help our children to make. But also, you know, even if we were all Aussies, there's still the question of, okay, how does Aussie culture compare with Bible culture? And we need, again, to help our children to understand what is God's call in regard to the way men treat women, husbands treat wives, and so forth. And then one last passage over in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25. This is a passage I talked about a bit last week. Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. And I made the point from previous verses there that sometimes religious men can have the view that, look, God made me the boss in the house. And so you can have a domineering attitude towards your wife and justify it on the grounds of religion. And this is one of the factors that is raised in books about domestic violence. There is this idea of gender ideology, that, you know, men are shaped to have a certain view of women and women are shaped to have a certain view of men. And in the extreme, that leads to problems. If you've got male chauvinism or if you've got radical feminism, then you've got a real problem in the relationship between men and women. And the Bible can be misused to justify some of that. And so as we teach our children, we've got to help our children to have a right view of what the Bible is teaching and help them to see what the Bible is not teaching and to see how the Bible relates to relationships, to things like parenthood and marriage as well. So there's a range of ways in which parents can seek to shape their children, prepare your children in regard to marriage and relationships with women. There's teaching, there's setting a positive example, there's correction there's cultural guidance, and there's religious guidance. There is an old saying, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. Just down the road from our house in Launceston, when we lived in Tasmania, there was a tree where the trunk had grown in a knot. Now, obviously, somebody many years earlier had got to that tree while it's a sapling, whether you could bend it, and they tied it into a knot. And that's how the tree had grown. And you can do that. Lavinia and I were watching a show last Monday, and it showed how a man was making wooden furniture from trees. Now, it wasn't that he was chopping down trees, getting the wood and making the furniture. He was growing the trees into furniture. So he planted all these saplings, and then as the saplings grew, he would bend them in one direction and pin them there. And then 6 months later, he'd bend them in another direction. And so it went on that you had a chair after a certain number of years. That's a very slow way of making furniture. But nevertheless, you know, he was doing pots and chairs and other things by growing them on this principle that as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. Now, what does this illustrate? The principle that we shape our children from early life, pointing them in the right direction. As it said in Proverbs 22 and verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go, even when he grows older, he will not abandon it. So we can shape our children here. And I'm not just talking about overcoming or avoiding domestic violence and abuse. Other things arise in regard to marriage. There can be tension, conflict, verbal conflict, psychological conflict. There can be separation. There can be divorce. And what we need to do is to try to shape our children so that they can grow up to have the right attitudes, to have the positive sort of relationship that God intended for marriage to be. That doesn't happen just by accident. That is something that children learn as they grow up, and you as a parent are already shaping your children. You're already doing that. This is not about what might happen. This is happening now. And so, if we want to help our children to grow up, to experience marriage in a positive way, and to, you know, men dealing with women, women dealing with men, for it to be in a positive way, that's a process that begins, you could almost say, from birth. And the way you're conducting yourself in your marriage is shaping your children's views. So that's another reason why we need to look very carefully at ourselves. We had our oldest daughter staying with us this weekend. Luke, her son, is at camp. And she was getting ready to leave this morning to head off to the camp. And she's hustling the youngest daughter to, come on, get ready. We need to go, get ready. I thought, where have I seen that behaviour before? Well, it's me. Lavinia will tell you I'm sort of on the way to being compulsive, obsessive, or something like that. And I'm very time focused. I need to be out at a certain time, and I'm the sort of person who will get somewhere half an hour early just to be sure. And there it is in my daughter. And it's probably going to be in her children too. So we are having an influence. And let's try for it to be a positive influence. Let's stand.